Welcome back to Above the Clouds, the Untold Stories of Aviation. I'm your host, and if you listen to our first episode, you join me on an incredible journey from ancient myths to that historic moment at Kitty Hawk when the Wright brothers first proved that human flight was possible. But here's something that might surprise you. After that momentous day in 1903, aviation didn't immediately transform the world the way we might expect. In fact, for the first decade and a half after Kitty Hawk, flight remained largely a curiosity, a spectacle for air shows and racing competitions. It took a global catastrophe to truly unlock aviation's potential, and that catastrophe was World War I. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating and overlooked chapters in aviation history. The story of how aircraft designed for war became instruments of personal freedom. How visionary individuals looked at military surplus airplanes and saw not weapons of destruction, but tools of liberation. And how their pioneering spirit laid the foundation for everything we do in private aviation today. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture yourself in 1918. The Great War has just ended, and suddenly there are thousands of military aircraft sitting in hangars across America and Europe, no longer needed for combat. Most people saw these as obsolete war machines, but a few remarkable individuals saw something entirely different. They saw the future of personal transportation. Let's start our story in November 1918, just days after the armistice was signed. The war is over, and America is celebrating. But in hangars across the country, there's a different kind of celebration happening. Pilots who had learned to fly in combat are looking at their aircraft with new eyes, asking themselves a revolutionary question. What if we could use these machines not for war, but for peace? Not for destruction, but for connection. Now, to understand why this moment was so significant, you need to understand what World War I did for aviation technology. When the war began in 1914, military aircraft were barely more advanced than the Wright Flyer. They were slow, unreliable, and used primarily for reconnaissance. But by 1918, after 4 years of intense technological development driven by the life and death needs of combat, aircraft had been transformed. Think about this progression. In 1914, military aircraft could barely reach 70 miles per hour and had a range of maybe 100 miles. By 1918, fighters like the SPA-DS.13 could reach 130 miles per hour, and bombers could fly for hundreds of miles carrying substantial loads. The war had accelerated aviation development by decades in just 4 years. But here's what's really important for our story today. The war didn't just advance aircraft technology, it created something even more valuable, a generation of skilled pilots. By the end of World War I, there were over 20,000 trained pilots in America alone, men who had learned to fly in the most demanding conditions imaginable and who understood aircraft capabilities better than anyone in history. These pilots faced a choice. They could hang up their goggles and return to earthbound careers, or they could find ways to keep flying. Fortunately, for all of us who fly today, many of them chose to keep flying, and in doing so, they created the foundation of civilian aviation. Let me tell you about one of these pioneers, a man whose story perfectly illustrates this transition from military to civilian aviation. His name was Eddie Rickenbacker, and he was America's top fighter ace during World War I, with 26 confirmed victories. But what he did after the war was even more remarkable than what he accomplished during it. In 1919, Rickenbacker looked at the surplus military aircraft flooding the market and saw an opportunity. He understood that these machines, designed for the rigors of combat, were actually perfect for civilian use. They were reliable, they were fast, and most importantly, they were available at a fraction of what it would cost to develop new civilian aircraft from scratch. Rickenbacker became one of the first aviation entrepreneurs, using his war surplus aircraft to start an air transport company. But here's what made him truly visionary. He didn't just see aircraft as tools for carrying mail or cargo. He saw them as vehicles for carrying people, for connecting communities, for shrinking the vast distances that separated American cities. Now, I want you to imagine what it was like to be a passenger on one of these early civilian flights. Picture yourself in 1920, climbing into the open cockpit of a converted military aircraft. There's no pressurized cabin, no flight attendants, no in-flight entertainment. Just you, the pilot, and the vast sky ahead. The aircraft climbs to maybe 3,000 feet, and suddenly, you're seeing the world from a perspective that only a few hundred people in human history had ever experienced. Cities look like toy models. Rivers become silver ribbons, and the curvature of the earth begins to become visible on the horizon. For the first time in your life, you understand what the birds have always known, that the earth is just one small part of a much larger universe. This is the moment when aviation truly became personal, not just a tool for war or a spectacle for crowds, but a means of individual transformation. And this is exactly what we provide in private aviation today, just with levels of comfort, safety, and luxury that those early pioneers could never have imagined. But let's talk about the people who were wealthy enough to afford these early private flights, because their stories reveal something important about the nature of aviation and human ambition. These weren't just rich people looking for expensive toys. These were visionaries who understood that aviation represented a fundamental shift in human capability. Take Howard Hughes, for example. In the 1920s and 1930s, Hughes wasn't just buying aircraft. He was pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could do. He set speed records. He funded advanced aircraft development. And he understood that aviation wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about expanding human possibilities. Hughes once said, "I want to be remembered as the man who brought aviation to the masses." And while he's often portrayed as an eccentric billionaire, the truth is that his investments in aviation technology and his publicity-generating flights helped convince the public that aviation wasn't just for daredevils and military pilots. It was for anyone who valued speed, efficiency, and the freedom to travel on their own terms. Here's something that might surprise you about these early private aviation pioneers. They weren't just passengers. They were active participants in advancing aviation technology. Many of them learned to fly themselves, understanding that to truly appreciate aviation's potential, you needed to understand how aircraft worked and what they were capable of. This hands-on approach to aviation is something we still see in private aviation today. Many of our clients are pilots themselves, or at least have a deep appreciation for aviation technology and capabilities. They understand that private aviation isn't just about luxury, it's about precision, reliability, and the marriage of advanced technology with human expertise. Now, let me tell you about a flight that changed everything. On May 20th, 1927, a young airmail pilot named Charles Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field in New York in a single-engine aircraft called the Spirit of St. Louis. His destination was Paris, France, over 3,600 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. No one had ever flown solo across the Atlantic before, and many experts believed it was impossible. 33.5 hours later, Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Field in Paris to a crowd of over 100,000 people. In that single flight, he had proven that aircraft could reliably cover vast distances, that aviation technology had advanced to the point where intercontinental flight was not just possible, but practical. But here's what's really important about Lindbergh's flight for our story today. It wasn't just a demonstration of aviation technology. It was a demonstration of aviation's potential to connect the world, to make distance irrelevant, to transform how humans thought about geography and time. Within months of Lindbergh's flight, applications for pilot licenses increased by over 300%. Aircraft sales soared. Investment in aviation companies exploded. The public had finally understood what those early pioneers had seen, that aviation wasn't just a novelty or a military tool, it was the future of human transportation. This brings us to the 1930s, what I consider the first golden age of private aviation. By this time, Aircraft manufacturers were designing planes specifically for civilian use, not just converting military surplus. Companies like Beechcraft, Cessna, and Piper were creating aircraft that were reliable, comfortable, and designed for the specific needs of private owners and operators. Let me paint a picture for you of what private aviation looked like in the 1930s. Imagine you're a successful businessman in 1935. You own a Beechcraft Model 17 Stagger Wing, one of the most advanced private aircraft of its time. This isn't a converted military plane. This is a purpose-built civilian aircraft with an enclosed cabin, comfortable seating for 4 passengers, and the ability to cruise at 200 miles per hour. You're planning a business trip from New York to Chicago. On a commercial airline, if you can even get a seat, the journey will take most of a day with multiple stops. But in your Stagger Wing, you can make the trip in under 4 hours, departing when you want, arriving exactly where you need to be, with no delays, no crowds, and no compromises. This is when private aviation truly came into its own as a business tool. Forward-thinking executives realized that aircraft weren't just faster than ground transportation, they were more flexible. They could reach destinations that weren't served by airlines. They could operate on schedules that matched business needs rather than airline timetables. And they could provide a level of privacy and productivity that was impossible on commercial flights. But I want to tell you about something even more significant that was happening during this period. Private aviation was beginning to democratize flight in a way that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Flying clubs were forming across the country, where groups of pilots would share the cost of aircraft ownership. Flight training schools were opening, making pilot licenses accessible to middle-class Americans for the first time. This is a pattern we see throughout aviation history, and it's something that drives everything we do in private aviation today. Advanced technology that begins as exclusive and expensive gradually becomes more accessible and affordable, but without sacrificing the quality and capabilities that made it valuable in the first place. Think about it this way. In 1920, private flight was available only to the wealthiest individuals who could afford to buy and maintain their own aircraft. By 1930, flying clubs and partnerships made it accessible to successful professionals. By 1940, flight training was available to almost anyone with the dedication to learn. Today, we've continued that evolution. Through charter services, fractional ownership, and jet card programs, private aviation is accessible to a much broader range of travelers than ever before. You don't need to own a $50 million aircraft to experience the freedom and flexibility of private flight. You just need to value your time and understand the advantages that private aviation provides. Let me share with you a story that perfectly illustrates how these early private aviation pioneers thought about flight. In 1938, a wealthy industrialist named William Boeing, yes, the same Boeing whose name is on commercial aircraft today, was planning a vacation with his family. Instead of taking a train or driving, he decided to fly his private aircraft from Seattle to the East Coast. But here's what made this trip special. Boeing didn't just fly directly to his destination. He planned a route that would take his family over some of the most beautiful scenery in America. They flew over the Rocky Mountains, across the Great Plains, and along the eastern seaboard. For Boeing's children, this wasn't just transportation, it was an adventure, an education, and a way of seeing their country that would have been impossible by any other means. This is what I mean when I say that private aviation is about more than just getting from point A to point B. It's about the journey itself, about the freedom to choose your own path, about the ability to see the world from a perspective that transforms how you understand geography, distance, and possibility. Boeing later said that this trip convinced him that private aviation would eventually become as common as automobile ownership. While that prediction hasn't quite come true, his vision of aviation as a tool for personal freedom and family adventure certainly has. Every day, we help families create memories and experiences that would be impossible without private aviation. Now, I want to talk about something that these early private aviation pioneers understood instinctively, something that remains at the heart of private aviation today: the relationship between pilot and passenger. In the early days of civilian aviation, there was no clear distinction between professional pilots and aircraft owners. Many wealthy individuals who owned aircraft also learned to fly them themselves. This created a culture of aviation expertise and appreciation that we still see today. Our clients don't just use private aviation, they understand it. They appreciate the skill required to fly complex aircraft, the precision needed for safe operations, and the technology that makes modern private aviation possible. This understanding creates a partnership between our pilots and our clients that you simply don't find in commercial aviation. When you're flying privately, you're not just a passenger being transported from one place to another. You're a participant in one of humanity's greatest achievements, working with skilled professionals who share your appreciation for the freedom and capability that aviation provides. Let me tell you about one more pioneer from this era, a woman whose story illustrates just how transformative private aviation could be for individuals who understood its potential. Her name was Jacqueline Cochran, and in the 1930s, she was running a successful cosmetics business while also becoming one of America's most accomplished pilots. Cochran understood something that many business leaders are just beginning to appreciate today: that private aviation isn't an expense, it's a competitive advantage. She used her aircraft to visit customers, suppliers, and business partners across the country with a speed and flexibility that her competitors couldn't match. While they were limited by train schedules and automobile travel times, she could be anywhere in the country within hours. But Cochran's story illustrates something even more important. She didn't just use private aviation for business. She used it to expand her horizons, to set records, to push boundaries, and to demonstrate that aviation could transform not just how we travel, but how we think about what's possible in our lives. This is the legacy of those early private aviation pioneers. They didn't just see aircraft as faster horses or flying automobiles. They saw them as tools for expanding human potential, for connecting distant places, for making the impossible routine and the extraordinary accessible. As we wrap up today's episode, I want you to think about the courage and vision of those early private aviation pioneers. They took aircraft designed for war and transformed them into instruments of peace. They took technology that was experimental and dangerous and made it reliable and practical. They took an activity that was exclusive to military pilots and made it accessible to civilian adventurers and business leaders. But most importantly, they established the principles that still guide private aviation today, the understanding that flight is about freedom, not just transportation, the recognition that aviation technology should serve human needs and ambitions, the belief that the sky isn't a barrier to be overcome, but a realm to be explored and enjoyed. Every time you step aboard a private aircraft today, you're continuing the journey that began with those post-World War I pioneers. The aircraft are more advanced, the safety systems are more sophisticated, and the comfort levels are beyond anything those early aviators could have imagined. But the fundamental promise remains the same: the freedom to travel on your own terms, to your own destinations, on your own schedule. When we plan a complex international itinerary for a client, when we coordinate ground transportation and customs clearance, when we ensure that every detail of a journey is perfect, we're honoring the vision of those early pioneers who saw aviation not as a novelty or a luxury, but as a tool for expanding human possibility. Next time on Above the Clouds, we'll explore the golden age of air travel in the 1930s, when commercial aviation briefly captured the glamour and luxury that we associate with private aviation today. We'll discover how airlines of that era treated every passenger like a VIP, and how that standard of service influenced the development of modern private aviation. We'll meet the visionaries who understood that flying wasn't just about getting somewhere faster. It was about transforming the journey itself into an experience worthy of the miracle of human flight. Until then, remember that every time you choose private aviation, you're not just choosing convenience or luxury. You're choosing to participate in the continuation of humanity's greatest adventure, the conquest of the sky and the expansion of human freedom. This has been Above the Clouds, the Untold Stories of Aviation. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time, Above the Clouds.